Okay, our next panel discussion, challenges of managing a global business. We have some great panelists who come from diverse business sectors and areas of the globe, and they will provide us with their unique perspectives regarding the impacts and implications for managing and driving success in this dynamic global environment. And to moderate our panel, Antoinette is back on stage, and I'll hand it over to her.
Yeah, you can put this here. Okay, cool. Great. Yeah. Great. Well, so I'm back. By now you know me. But I'm delighted to be on stage with such an outstanding panel of female leaders in very, as you will see, diverse areas of business. And what we want to talk about and the topic we wanted to address today is really how in the 21st century, globalization, the changing geography of wealth creation, of where growth happens in the world, what challenges does this provide to businesses, and as you will see, very different businesses, and also what challenges does this present to how you manage those dynamics and in a way this shifting and diverse environment in which growth happens these days. And to talk to us about these topics, we have an outstanding panel. To my left is Michele de Nevers. She comes to us from the CGD, but she also has 30 years of experience in the World Bank in global development, and she will be able to talk to us about very diverse programs that she ran between private and public sector and the importance of environmental change, global changes in this arena. Next to her is Mary Puma, who is the CEO of a semiconductor firm, Axcelis, the only woman CEO in this area. And as we heard, actually, if you remember from Alex in the panel before, this is not an industry that is necessarily the one embracing the most changes. So it will be really interesting to hear from her how she managed her environment. Next to her is Liesbet Peeters, who runs a investment company. She's a leader in impact investment, and the company she manages and co-founded is D Capital Partners. It's a private wealth management firm, but in particular focused on impact investment and global investment in emerging markets, areas like Africa, South America. And then finally, but last but very much not least, even though I should say that this is how life is, I was really worried that Debra will not make it to stage because she was just taking another conference call while we were getting set up. So Debra Stabile, who is managing director at Citi, and she leads actually Citi's risk office for civil retail services, CRS, where she is in charge of retail financial products such as credit cards, and we look forward to hearing much more about it. But to get us started off, what I wanted to ask all of you is to talk a bit from the different industries and the different areas that you're in about how globalization and how the changes in a global environment are affecting your different industries. And maybe, Koerner, if we can just go from left to right here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Antoinette, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. I haven't seen this many MIT women, well, ever, I think, in one place. I was really happy last night at the dinner when I heard all these people stand up and talk about how Sloan students want to solve all the problems of the world. So I have a problem for you. In the area of globalization, I work on development and climate change. And climate change is one of the very biggest global challenges that exist. As you know, we are currently on a trajectory to get to an increase in global average temperatures of between 4 and 6 degrees by the end of the century if we don't do anything. The commitments made in Paris were voluntary and only get us about halfway there if they're accomplished. So we need some changes. At the same time, when we work, those of us who work in economic development realize that countries that are developing need to grow, and what they need to grow is energy. Energy is highly correlated with economic growth, and it's a really important factor. And so there's this tension between how can we assure that countries that need energy to grow will get the access to the energy they need for their growth, while at the same time we try to curtail the emissions of greenhouse gases and stop dangerous climate change. What needs to happen is a couple of things. One is we need to decouple economic growth from energy use. So we need to be able to build more housing, more transport, more manufacturing, using less energy. And we need to decarbonize energy, take the carbon out of energy and make it zero or low carbon. The International Energy Agency estimates that 80%, we will need an 80% increase in energy by 2050. And 95% of the growth in energy between now and then will come from non-OECD countries. So these are developing countries. So here's the problem: growth of energy in developing countries. It will cost a lot to be able to build this infrastructure and to ensure that it's green. The World Economic Forum estimates that a cumulative $44 trillion will be needed for investment in energy by 2040, and an additional 23 trillion by just for energy efficiency. That averages out to about $3 to $4 trillion a year. So those of us who work in development and say, great, we need all this green infrastructure investment, where's the money? And it's not in impact investor pools. It's not in socially responsible investor pools. It's not in green bonds. The big money sits in institutional investor pools, mutual funds, pensions, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, et cetera. There's an estimate that in 2014, that added up to about $70 trillion. So we see this, here's the investment need, here's the money, what's the problem? The problem is, if you look at the portfolios of institutional investors, they are about 40% equities, 40% fixed income, and 20% other. Within that other are alternative investments, alternative assets. And within that subset, another subset is emerging alternative investments. That's where infrastructure in emerging markets sits. They sit in the smallest part of the portfolio of institutional investors. So last year I was at an MIT finance conference where Professor Andrew Lo talked about his paper on how financial engineering can cure cancer. So I would like to ask you guys to figure out how financial engineering can solve climate change. And it shouldn't be that hard.
Right.
The reason that the reason that institutional investors don't put more money into this important asset class is because of risk and scale, and probably more. The risks are technology risk, sovereign risk, foreign exchange risk, lots of different kind of risks. But there are risk management tools, and the other is scale. A lot of these are small projects or small companies investing in projects. How can we aggregate them into a scale that will be appropriate for institutional investors who, as one professor said, don't get out of bed for less than $10 billion? So this is the financial engineering challenge that I work on in my day job, and I would like to have some smart Sloan people figure out how to solve for us. Thank you.
That's not a small challenge that you're posing to us, but actually the person next to you, I feel, has made some of those translations into an industry that's extremely capital intensive, very technology intensive. And so, Mary, maybe you want to talk about how within semiconductors that globalization has played out and how you see it happening in your industry.
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background on Axcelis. We are a semiconductor equipment company. We do not make the chips, we make the equipment that makes the chips. And the specific area that we focus on, it's called ion implantation, and it's used in the front end of line of a semiconductor fab or factory to actually make the transistors. We joke all the time that it is rocket science. It's incredibly complex. We have been a public company since, we've been in business over 35 years. We've been a public company since 2000, listed on the NASDAQ, and we have about between 26 and 28% market share of ion implantation. If you take a look at the broader industry, this year the forecast is that revenues for semiconductors will be about $400 billion, and $81 billion will go towards the equipment that actually manufactures the chips. I think we all know that content requiring semiconductors or transistors just is exploding. Every year it continues to grow, and it goes well beyond PCs or mobile devices. Right now we have the Internet of Things and big data just really driving the industry. That said, there are some characteristics of the semiconductor and semiconductor equipment industry that are very challenging and have changed over time. The industry is quite cyclical. It actually tends to fluctuate very closely to the state of the economy, driven by consumers and businesses and the investments they're making. It's also driven by competitive forces. Some of our customers actually decide not only to invest when things are good, but to invest when things are not good, so they'll be ready for when things get better. And it's just classic supply and demand kinds of things that are in play here. So we have some really good years and we have some really bad years. It's a little bit of feast and famine. There's been a tremendous amount of consolidation. If you look over the last 15 years at our customers who manufacture logic chips, it's gone from 15 to 4 companies, and there's been a similar decline in our customers who actually make memory devices as well. Costs are just out of this world. It takes a tremendous amount of R&D to develop the chips, to develop the equipment, to make a semiconductor fab, depending on the type of chip that will be manufactured, ranges from $4 to $10 billion. So again, very significant investment. And the other thing, and this is where I'll get into the globalization piece of it, is that there's been a tremendous shift from the US and Japan into other Asian countries in terms of where the actual chips are manufactured. So I'll just give 3 brief examples. Let's look at the successful model, Korea. Korea has done an amazing job. In the 1960s, Korea's economy was equivalent to that of a poor African country. By 2004, it was a $1 trillion economy. And it's been driven by a number of things, but a lot of it specifically tied to electronics and semiconductors. And the Koreans are actually they're amazing people. It was really done by a lot of investment, but a lot of hard work. They have their own challenges. We've all recently read about President Park and some of the issues there and her impeachment. There is corruption also among the corporations. And interestingly, one of the significant impacts is that when there are issues at these corporations, so 2 of our largest customers are Samsung and SK Hynix. So they've got chaebols similar to the Keiretsus in Japan. So it's the Samsung group and the SK group. They've both had their chairman and top managers in prison, some of them multiple times. And it has a significant impact on the investment decisions they make. How much are they going to invest? When are they going to invest? The cultures of the companies. It actually literally impacts how employees of those companies operate, things that they do professionally and personally. So it's very interesting. That said, I spend a lot of time in Korea, and I love the country. I love the people. Again, they're fair, they're tough but fair, they're very emotional. They're called, I don't know if you've ever heard this before, the Italians of the East. And I can say that because I'm of Italian descent, it's okay. Well, a lot of emotion and excitement, but a lot of hard work, and it's certainly paid off. The example in process, China. China buys over $200 billion worth of semiconductors every year. You can imagine this is a tremendous outlay of cash that they don't want to have to make. And also, from a national security standpoint, they do not want to have to rely on other countries for their semiconductors. Over the last 15 years, they've tried 3 times to make a go at becoming a powerhouse. First time they just kind of went for it and invested in local universities. They did a lot of joint ventures with universities, and they just kind of went at it. 10 years later, that hadn't worked tremendously well. So they went at it a second time, and they actually then tried to import technologists, and they came up with their list of top 1,000 technologists. And that was only moderately successful. So fast forward to 2015. The third try now is to invest $100 billion, mostly that's from the Chinese government. There are some investment funds associated with it where they just decided they were going to buy their way in. So they've bought some chip design companies, they've bought a few chip manufacturers, they've bought some equipment companies, and we'll see. Part of what they're up against right now, they're never going to give this up. They will keep at it, they will keep investing because it's so important to them, but what they're up against right now is that the United States and the EU do not want to give the technology to China. So some of those acquisitions that they've tried to make have been killed. So again, we'll see where that goes, but they're going to keep at it. And then there's the US and Japan, where our governments over time had invested a tremendous amount of money, but then backed off. And as a result, Japan has actually become a niche supplier of semiconductors. I think you probably all recently read that Toshiba sold its semiconductor unit to an international group of both investors as well as companies. And the United States, I mean, we still have great companies like Intel and Micron, but we are nowhere close to being the powerhouse that we once were. So it's had a tremendous impact on our business. We follow the money, and so we've had to shift resources significantly away from the US and Europe and to Asia. Using China as the example, it's a big country. And these fabs are being put in incredibly remote locations. So if you're going to do business with the customer, you literally have to almost start from scratch in terms of, we have sales and service and application support, parts depots, very expensive. So again, there's a lot of investment going there. The cycles have driven us to become very flexible. Excuse me, I hate to say this, but restructuring is a core competency. No, we've literally had to take lots of people out over the years. We've come up with innovative programs called, for example, temporary leave of absence, where particularly with our factory, we've put them out on unpaid leave for like 3 months at a time, but the state of Massachusetts would pay, we would keep their benefits and the state of Massachusetts would pay unemployment. A very creative solution to a problem. We've done a lot of unpaid shutdowns. So it's been a good way to keep the workforce together. We were talking about this last night because we've laid so many people off. The average age of our workforce is 52 years, which for a high-tech company in Massachusetts is really old. So we're dealing right now with the gray tsunami, but as our business improves and gets better, we are hiring a lot of younger workers. I think the final thing, and then I'll pass it along here, is this whole idea of what's a competitive advantage in this industry. Particularly with the Asians, it's all about relationships. And so we spend, I spend a lot of time on the road with my customers. It's all about developing the relationships and providing the support and customer service that they want, and being able to respond to them. And in particular, that's something that we do even as a small company relative to our large competitor. And I think that's one of the major things that differentiates us.
Wonderful, thank you. I love the gray tsunami, and I'm very glad for modern chemistry. I think, you know, what both of you have also highlighted, right, is that these big problems we face in the world right now need more than just potentially private solutions, but private-public solutions that not, you know, as you described, often can also, you know, fail. It's just big risks we need to deal with. And I wanted to ask Liesbet, who actually works, if you want, on the other end of that, you know, investment chain, to talk about how these globalization trends have affected much smaller scale investments, right? Micro investments in emerging markets that are not as capital intensive, but not less difficult to manage either.
No, exactly. And just to put a little bit of context on it, thanks to MIT, 12 years ago, I had my internship in Ivory Coast in the middle of the civil conflict at the time to help them think through microfinance and microfinance solutions for some of the factory workers that were trying to make a living in the middle of the conflict. And ever since, over the last 12 years, have been doing the same in very different industries and areas. And I think when you look at sort of like the flip side, like there is another sort of like reality around globalization and one what we like used to call the forgotten or the lost continent or the last continent, like which is sub-Saharan Africa, which is fast becoming like one of the biggest emerging markets that you can't overlook. And the realities of those markets are very different. You're dealing with what we call the base of the pyramid, where most of the people live below $5 or $10 a day. And it took me a few years to wrap my head around what that means. Because, like you come from a developed economy and, like the world where when you think about basic supply and demand, you're sort of like somewhere always around the equilibrium. Whereas in these markets, you're on the edges and you're always dealing in situations of scarcity. And when people think about what they were looking for and the wealth creation, like that they're seeking, it's around real economic value. It's around giving them food. It's around giving them energy to access to energy, access to education, healthcare, and basic jobs. And there's a real sort of like, I think, underlying current and issue that we will need to deal with at a global level, which is the fact that sub-Saharan Africa is a continent where 50% of the population is less than 25 years old. And only 9% of that population goes to higher education. It's an uneducated, immensely young population that will be seeking employment and employment opportunities, and that will be looking for real economic opportunities. If I then marry that with what Michele was talking about, which is the climate change issue, like they are seeking solutions. And so we've spent a lot of time embedding those issues with real innovative ways of building public-private partnerships across the public sector, across the private sector, to bring these two worlds together and to bring the angle of sustainable development, like into that conversation. And I think I can't emphasize it enough. Like it is one of probably the biggest challenges facing emerging markets is how to have that debate and how to take the time to think about long-term sustainable goals and bring the different stakeholders that are necessary to make these things work at the table and make them stay at the table until they have found a solution. Michele again mentioned, like sustainable development goals, something that the United Nations has come up. We have built a field that we call impact investing over the last 10 years. 2 weeks ago, I was next door at the Mandarin at the Global Impact Investing Network conference. And 10 years ago, nobody knew what impact investing was. And 2 weeks ago, we had the CEO of Philips and the Vice President of Bank of America boosting against each other of who's the biggest impact investor, which was phenomenal. But the problem was that the CEO of Philips is describing it as, I have impact because I provide 2 billion people with light bulbs. And I would be like, well, actually, not really. Because if you go down to the village and you try to figure out, like where those light bulbs are being sold, the distribution models, like to people that only have $2 a day, like is very different. And so if, probably a lot of you in the room have heard about pay-as-you-go systems, like where we had to re-engineer the distribution model and look at, like what is the consumption pattern of a person, like with $2 a day rather than $20 a day, and what can they afford? They can't afford to buy a solar panel. They can't afford to buy a fridge. Like that's a capital expenditure that, like would take them probably 2-year wage. They don't have a 2-year wage. They don't have savings like that. You can't actually design a savings scheme that would, like allow them to buy that fridge. So what you do is you lease them the fridge, and you have them, like pay for the consumption, very much like the laundromat system, like you give them quarters. And so figuring out holistically across the different stakeholders, the person that sells the fridge, the person that is going to use it, the person that is from the government or the community, the banker who is going to provide the financing, and coming up with inclusive ways of distributing the wealth and the economic value and who's going to benefit from what and where is something that we have seen is really key in making some of these problems turn into real solutions. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of partners coming, needing to come together. I'll use one example that I think I'm the most proud of. 2 years ago, we were working with an NGO that is working with about 10,000 smallholder farmers in the north of Nigeria. And if some of you are familiar with the north of Nigeria, one of the provinces there is extremely prone to the Boko Haram conflict. And so farming is one of the livelihood, economic development, areas. A lot of families depend on it. And we wanted to give them some financing to buy the seeds and the fertilizer to get their yields up. But none of the bankers would touch it. One, because smallholder farmers don't represent a very good credit risk, which I'm sure everybody who's in finance here, will agree with. And secondly, in that area, it's kind of difficult to go and do debt collection when you think about it. So we were thinking about getting them an insurance. Because we know the NGO very well, they have a lot of assistance programs, etc. So Swiss Re came up with an insurance product and said, we'll provide it. The problem was that the NGO is an NGO, and Swiss Re insurance products are based out of the Cayman Islands. Cayman Islands law requires you to have a minimum balance sheet of about $10 million before you can be a counterparty to an insurance product. Now, obviously, an NGO in Nigeria doesn't have a $10 million balance sheet. So we had another reinsurance company reinsure the NGO's outstanding track record. And so together, put the whole deal together. And by now, it's about 40,000 farmers. They get their financing from the local bank. Almost none of them have defaulted. And, it's a fantastic story.
It's a fantastic story, especially, as a finance professor. I always love when, finance is not the bottleneck, but the solution.
Exactly.
And but I mean, it's really true that, you're describing kind of the power of functioning retail financial markets and what it actually can do to transform people's lives, exactly. Which, by the way, is a great segue to our last panelist, which is Debra, because in her work, right, that's something that you do a lot, maybe not in a development market context, but globally.
Globally, yes. So my responsibilities, I'm the Chief Risk Officer for our, we have 2 credit card companies in North America, so we cover the US and Canada. But the challenges that and the way we manage within that sector definitely extend globally. Citi, which is the company I work for, is a global company, and so the actions that you take, whether you sit in the US or you sit in Thailand or Singapore, matter, and how we govern, how we manage the business is definitely evaluated across. So as we think about extending credit and making it available, there is a lot that goes into thinking through how we would extend credit. And so we think about things such as the quality of the individual, which requires us to understand about that individual. In the US, we have an incredible amount of information that we can use, and then we have information we'd like to use and can't use. And in other countries, as we compare what we can do as we sit at the table, we have to think through how we can equate as regulators come in. So in terms of managing, I think about the talent I have, the people I have, I think about the regulatory requirements, and I think about the capabilities that are available in terms of extending credit. And in terms of talent, we've been taking advantage of, well, let me step back for a second. So as you can imagine, the credit card industry is a very competitive industry. It's competitive among the big banks as they compete for your using their products, but it's also competing now with the fintech companies. And the fintech companies have some major advantages in terms of being completely or relatively automated, whereas there is legacy in terms of the big banks, in terms of how they're relying on much more of a manual systems and people and infrastructure. And so as we look to reduce the amount of expenses that we have, we look at in every area that we possibly can. One of the areas that we have taken advantage of is using talent outside of the U.S. And so in my world, we have about a third of my team sits in India. And in India, and we've been able to take advantage of the talent there. Because Citi has a very strong reputation internationally, we've been able to draw from the best schools there and really leverage the abilities that they have in terms of bringing the younger generation into the company. If you were to look at the US, we also have, in some ways, a much more senior environment in terms of the talent that comes into the traditional banks. And we've been able to bring some of the best and brightest into our facilities in Mumbai, and they have been able to bring much more of the advanced analytics and capabilities for our decisioning. As we look at the regulatory environment, again, we are governed by US, but as we work in other countries, we're also making sure that not only are the US standards met, but the local standards. As we think about the capital requirements, we're also thinking through how do we ensure that we're covered. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. I just lost my train of thought.
But actually, let me, maybe it comes to you after I ask the question, but I wanted to actually ask you, how do you manage such a diverse workforce, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not just geographically time zone between India and here. You know, I do a lot of projects in India. It's always a pain to wake up at, 6 a.m. in the morning or wait till late at night. But I mean, the real problem is probably this managing across different expectations, different cultures. How does that affect
That's
your
a very good question. So in terms of how we're organized, we really try to make sure that the teams are the geography is a real, it can be a challenge, it can be an advantage, right? In terms of the quality of the talent. In my world, I have probably 8 or 9 sites, but 3 are predominant, a site in Atlanta, a site in Chicago, and this Mumbai site. And the reality of understanding culturally how they're different, making yourself available. The teams here, in terms of managing them, do have to accommodate the time and that, but it's more than that. There's the cultural, ensuring that they understand. So in my world, we have a couple of partnerships that we have with a Home Depot, a Best Buy, a Macy's, right? In India, they don't necessarily understand what a Home Depot is, and so what we do is we bring over classes of them, and we bring them in, and we have them meet with credit bureaus, we have them tour what a Home Depot is. What does it mean to actually extend credit, right? What does it mean to interact and have that experience at the point of sale in terms of applying for credit and really understanding what it means if you get rejected at the point of sale or something, right? So in terms of managing them, and then as Mary said, it's important to get over there and also have that interaction. We make sure our teams are going over there. And so there are cultural differences, but there are also lots of similarities as well. The worries about time, and it's not just women, it's men, but right now their time schedule is a 1 to 10 p.m. type of schedule. And as they start to mature, as they start to have families, they really want to be on a 9 to 5 schedule again. And so some of the very best talent that we have, we worry that we're going to lose. And we struggle to say, how do we balance that time? And how do we keep our best talent that's over there? How do they grow and have career pathing? Not just within my organization, but also beyond, right? So that they can enjoy their families, but also have that recognition and the ability. So those are the kinds of things. Their holidays are holidays, and they tend to, and how do we keep those aligned as best we can? And and in India, there are mandatory holidays where they will, legally, they cannot show up at work. I mean, they will be fined. I mean, I guess everybody knows that, but that was just, felt fairly recent to me.
Right.
So it's
and they're
challenging.
very involved holidays, where whole elephants get
Yes.
submerged. So you
Yes,
definitely don't want to miss that.
Thank you. It's wonderful because the other thing that's very interesting is that, I would say 5 years ago, 6 years ago, one of the aspirations, if you were working in India, was to come and work in the U.S. and continue your career in the U.S. And that really has diminished somewhat now. We definitely have a great pipeline of folks that will come in and work in the U.S., but there really is a desire to stay, and the middle class is certainly growing very rapidly in India, and I can see it in just as I continue to travel there. And it's a wonderful thing to say, but I would say also the salaries are rising, and so what used to be a very economical way, it's still economical, that gap is closing fairly rapidly now. And so, again, great talent, but...
That echoes with something Mary said before, right? This idea that the opportunities are shifting, and they're shifting away from the US. And you, in a way, you said you follow the money, but you also follow the market, I assume.
Absolutely.
And if, as Debra was saying, the aspiration is not to come to the US as the ultimate goal, how do you deal as a US corporation? How do you deal with this? How do you deal with recruitment, retaining talent in your company? Maybe you can share some best practices, some ideas on how you do that. Yeah, I'm talking you. Yeah.
So, well, we have offices all over the world wherever there's a semiconductor fab. And it is interesting because I think a lot of companies try to have compensation programs and benefits and other things that are pretty standard around the world. And we've come to realize you just can't do that for a lot of the reasons that have been raised here. So we have programs that are basically put together around some of the cultural issues and the requirements for each one of the countries we have. We recruit locally. We do use executive recruiters. We're looking for people with specific talent, so it's not like we have to go far and wide to actually find these people. And it's harder in some countries than others. For example, China, I'm sure everybody here has heard how the turnover rate there is, very, very high. So there are different things that we do from a retention standpoint in China than we would have to do in some of the other countries we have. I mean, in Europe, people don't want to leave. That's another whole issue when we go through the restructuring piece of it. So yes, we do, we definitely modify our programs to meet the needs of each country.
And have you found, this goes maybe back to something that Liesbet also said, that local solution might sometimes fill in, right, when the large companies leave. I would ask both of you, Mary and Liesbet, maybe to talk about, I see often in emerging markets that self-employment and more investment in self-employment becomes really important when there is nothing else, when there are no large companies to employ you. And I wonder, do we think, is that one of the avenues by which we can manage the growth in markets like Africa, Asia, or will there have to be a replication of a more corporatist, a more Western model of growth?
I think it's a great question. The entrepreneurial spirit of there being a vacuum of things out there and people starting to problem solve, I have found, like one of the most inspiring pieces of being active in these markets. Having said that, and I think kudos to the institute that, like we all, like went to, it's sort of like you go and you try and you'll ask for forgiveness after you blow up the lab rather than, like permission up front. You sort of like go in with that same mentality. Having said that, a lot of the local talent misses a number of really key skills, which means that, for instance, instance, when we have our teams also sitting in 20 different countries, we have 20 different countries, the US, Europe, and then Africa and Asia. When you put them all together, somebody who's 25 and who's an investment associate in Nairobi is 3 years behind the curve of an investment associate in London. But the problem is that we need to train them up, and we need to on the job. So you need to embed a lot more on the job skills training in giving them two things. One, some of the cognitive and tools that they just haven't gotten in secondary school and in the lack of tertiary education, and a number of leadership skills that come with, like not being part of more of a formal structure. So, like it's great to be, like entrepreneurial, like oftentimes, and the previous panel talked about that, but then at a certain point you hit that point of governance. And, like at what point do you then start putting in place certain structures and, like governance procedures and policies and anti-corruption. And if you have 90% of the workforce coming from that entrepreneurial self-starting, like we're just gonna problem solve for things, it becomes much more difficult to embed that in the conversation. And there is a number of efforts, like the Mandela Institute in South Africa, across Pan-African, to build in more leadership skills, the Desmond Tutu Fellows as well, to really bring that kind of like leadership development to a much younger generation than I think we see in other countries and in other contexts, because those are the real two shortfalls in their non-existing education, really.
I see. And this is actually, I want to give this question back to Michele in a way. This idea of, do you feel, you were asking for solutions to these really big, energy global problems, but do you see a path in the emerging markets where there is leadership emerging that actually is embracing these issues, is worrying about them, and also trying to come up with local solution? Or, it sounded you were asking for more, it has to come somehow from the outside, but maybe that's not what you meant, or, there must be lots of different strands going on, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, up till now, about 75% of the investment in climate mitigation is domestic. It's either government or from national development banks or even national private banks or from households. So not that much of it has been from international finance. But the scale of the problem is such that it's going to exceed the fiscal capabilities of governments or the lending capabilities of the banks. And in order to make these infrastructure investments green, there's an incremental cost. It will cost a little bit more. And so the question is how to get that financed. There's been a lot of experiments that have been done. People have thought about the fund of funds approach to address the scale issue, that you have small projects bundled into small-ish companies, bundled into maybe country funds, and then you can have a fund of funds. That has sort of come up against the anti-fund of funds feeling among investors these days, partly because of the costs fees and various things. So that's one avenue that's been approached. Guarantees are another instrument that has been experimented with. I mean, the problem is all these different kinds of experiments that have gone on have been very bespoke, very, handcrafted. There's an issue of scale just in the financing tools and instruments themselves. So clearly a lot of those investments will be financed locally, but in order to make sure that there's funding available to cover the incremental cost of the greener technologies, tapping into these large pools of finance will be useful. And the impact investors, small scale investors and others have done a lot, but the scale is still quite small, and they face the same issue of risk. You have emerging market risk, you have foreign exchange risk. You just add on these costs to a normal, what should be a plain vanilla financing challenge.
Right.
So,
well, lots of very interesting thoughts, right, around this issue of globalization providing opportunities and providing challenges for management, for much more complex organizations. But maybe we'll open the discussion again up to the audience to get more thoughts, more questions. I see the first hand was exactly in the back, in the middle.
Hi everyone. This is such a fantastic panel, by the way. So, great to be here. My name is Debra. I am MBA class of 2017, so brand new to the Alumni Association. One of the few days where I'm, excited not to be in school and be actually here. So I grew up in India. I was born and raised in India, and then I went to the UK for my undergrad, and I worked in London, and I came to the US for grad school. So I think if I were a business, I'd be global. And my question then is, all of you have touched on this in your comments, but when I think about my career and I think about how I can become a global leader, how would you kind of, share your experience and what I can do right now to be ready for a career that will span the rest of the world, especially coming from Western education and Western experiences. So, any insight would be grateful. Thank you.
Great question. Who would like to take up?
I'll share some, the thing that I found the most difficult, and I think what I had to learn the most is something that Renee touched upon, is you go into these things always with biases, unconscious biases from the place where you grew up to the place where you went to school and this and that. And I think one of the biggest things that I had to learn and that I credit, being able to continue to operate in these markets and this environment is a constant adaptation and self-learning. You need to be very self-aware and constantly be open to learn from everything and everybody around you. The other day, I have a 23-year-old South African who's more like a hip hop star than a financial analyst, and I have learned how to communicate, with my team over WhatsApp, and that's the way to get them to do things. And the other day I was like, you should put this on an email, and he was like, why? And I was like, well, that's a really good question. Compliance, regulation. We're FCA compliant. I need to show that we agreed on this. A WhatsApp printout is not going to work here. But
or a direct message on Twitter is not really.
Exactly. But the fact that he challenges me and you don't immediately go no, but you sort of think about that a little bit for yourself, and you and in all aspects, all around, in every encounter, you need to be very self-aware that oftentimes you're the one who needs to learn.
I would also say, if you look at the years that we graduated, you'll notice that Mary and Debra and I all graduated in the same year. And I went to MIT because I wanted to work at the World Bank. So I knew I wanted to have a global career. But when we graduated, I don't think either Debra or Mary would have thought that they would necessarily end up doing this whole global, now I'm in China and Korea and India. It just wasn't, the thing. But now it is. We're in a global world. And I would say just embrace every opportunity you have to get any kind of experience that is outside Boston or...
Right. I'll second that. You should definitely just go for it and see as much of the world as you can and work there. I think, tying it back to some of what we heard this morning, working in other countries as a woman is very different from working in the United States. And as difficult as it can be here, it can be really challenging, particularly in the Asian countries. So I guess the way I look at it now, I've been in the industry almost 20 years. I think the thing I'm most disappointed about is over those 20 years, I have not seen a significant improvement in the representation of women in this industry. Having said that, what I have learned is that it's really important to embrace your diversity. And I'll explain what I mean by that. What I tell people is 95% of the time being a woman works against me. But the 5% of the time when you can use it to your advantage, go for it. This sort of gets a little bit back to, should I take the board opportunity because they're looking for a woman? Absolutely. Use it to your advantage. And I'll give you an example. I talked about Korea, and I have really strong relationships with my Korean customers. I am very well known there. In fact, when I meet somebody who doesn't know me, they say, "You are very famous." I know who you are. You are very famous, because there aren't very many women. So I take advantage of that. When I go to Korea, I can get meetings with people, whereas some of my peers and competitors might not be able to. I do special things for my customers because I am a woman. I have had many of my key customers to my home for dinner. And I'm a terrible cook. My husband cooks for them. And
That's a good thing.
no, but you know, it's very interesting because in many cases they've never been into an American home. Mm-hmm. They like fillets, they like lobster. I mean, they come out, they drink a lot of wine instead of soju. They have a wonderful time, and it's the best way in the world to build a relationship. And again, I can tell you, my male counterparts don't do this, and they love it. And when some of them have children coming to Massachusetts, for example, going to school, I give them my card, all my phone numbers. I said, look, I'm a mother, okay? And I know if my kids were going to another country, I would want them to have a phone number in case there's an emergency. I've met many of them, taken them out to lunch. Those are the things where it almost sounds silly, but it's really, really important, and those are the relationships that at the end of the day, I really like my customers, so I'm not just doing this to be, you know, artificial, but it really makes a difference from a business perspective. So I think it's really important. You just need to think about some of those things.
I should also say, right, at Sloan in particular, you have the opportunity. It's a pedestrian point, but we actually make sure that you have opportunities to go and work with companies abroad, that you do projects, right? We have all these labs. So, you know, it's really something, you know, we need to encourage you to embrace. Yes, go ahead.
Barbara Samuels from the Global Clearinghouse of Development Finance. And I have to say, I congratulate us all being here, because when I was at MIT for 2 masters and a dual PhD, I felt men all around me. And to connect with 3 other women, I don't know if you realize, I was in your class, I was also doing political science. Also doing global work is just so special and magical. So I applaud everyone in this event. But to try and address the challenge that Michele put forward, first of all, let me just underline that there is synergy right up there on the panel, because your organization is part of Dahlberg, and Dahlberg has worked as technical support for Convergence, which is a matching platform between projects and investors, including institutional investors. But let me also stress that we, as Michele indicated, we are failing horribly. But within the MIT family, with others, we have a real opportunity. During the UN General Assembly, the African Union and NEPAD, representing African heads of state, launched the 5% Agenda, which is a mandate for all African. You asked about what can you do internally. The best source of investment in infrastructure are domestic institutional investors. And so this is a movement that's happening.
That's new.
Our biggest problem, as I explained to the people at Dahlberg and the OECD with STIP and other platforms, is the lack of bankable projects. And so we have been working with pension funds, sovereign wealth funds on this. There is movement, have some reports and some action steps on this. Would love to work on this. We talked briefly about the educational gap. We worked with Gates local financial hubs. We don't have, it's not just entrepreneurs, it is the people to identify, develop, risk mitigate, and finance projects locally. And so one of the opportunities actually is to have an online project finance course, aligned and blended learning with African and other universities, so we can really build the soldiers on the ground to do these things. And so I just think it's great. We got to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Actually, while you're formulating your questions, let me actually follow up on the last comment, which is, in a way, it's also a call, not just for education, right, as you said, but also, I feel, for technology and governance. And I wonder, when you think about your own industries, how much has technology been embraced already to help solve some of those problems, right? I mean, a lot of your day-to-day management problems have probably changed quite a bit with the technology that is now much more available. I understand WhatsApp can be a challenge, but can also be a way of monitoring, the population. So
yeah. No, I think technology is, one is huge. I think the leapfrogging, like in the mobile technology across Africa is well known. Like these days farmers, like check the commodity prices before they actually, like harvest their soya and sell it. We're going to see the same thing. So I think fintech, like as Debra was mentioning, is going to be huge. Like as well in the energy space, the off-grid, like energy is driven by some technological innovation. I think the one that maybe people are less aware of and where I can see huge potential, and we were talking last night with Liesbet and a few others about artificial intelligence, big data, etc., is a number of these emerging markets don't have sophisticated or well-developed capital markets, especially on the public side and the pension fund side. And I think that one of the missed or like not yet developed leapfrogging opportunities, especially in tech, is going to be how do you link how do you build pension fund markets in markets where there is nothing existing yet, with a direct link between the pensioner and the opportunities that they're seeking to build. And those questions are already starting to come up. Even like people within our teams that are sitting in these emerging markets, they don't have a pension plan. And a little bit to the same point that you were mentioning, Mary, it's like you try to come up with HR policies that are like adapted to the local context, but like fair across. And so my team was like, well, why don't we design our own pension plan? And I was like, well, there's pension regulation and all of that and this and that. But, like if you extrapolate that, like, and put some technology around that, like that could be huge. I think we underestimate. I mean, MIT has the Solve initiative, which sort of like tries to bring like technology to some of these challenges. I think a lot of people are trying to do it. Like we can't overestimate, like the importance of technology going forward, for sure.
I'm sure. Debra, you were telling me before about the challenges you face. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think technology, like anything else, is a blessing, but we have to be so careful. There's so much we share on the internet. We had the Equifax breach a couple of years ago, days ago. Feels like months ago with all the time we're spending on it. But the reality is there's so much of your personal information that's already out there that people can access. And so how we protect ourselves and how we can benefit from that, it's redefining everything we do, how we shop, how we pay, whether we're here in the States or elsewhere. And just the amount of information that people have on you and the ability to process it is faster and faster. So their ability to take your information and either do good by it or challenge you is something we spend a lot of time working through, because it is it is informative, but it is also something that can harm. So I don't want to end on a bad note, but I'm just, I would emphasize, just be as careful as you can be with what you share, as you already know that, but it's important.
But do you see the attitude changing? This year I'm in London, visiting the university there, and I'm reminded again about Europeans are much more suspicious of the sharing of information and much more guarded about wanting to maintain property rights of one's information. Do you feel that, in the US,
it's changing now. I mean, and you may all be doing this, is people are running to the bureaus and locking their credit bureaus and things like that, which will prove a challenge when you then want to apply for credit again, because unwinding can be difficult, but they're working on how to do that. But I find that people are more suspicious, but still not cutting back at the levels of what they're willing to share. So it's interesting. And what happens is that in the regulatory environment, there is a lot of information one would want to use, but cannot, to extend to the unbanked populations and others that have difficulty getting access. There is, It's just how do you get at that information? Yeah.
Right. Lots of changes, lots of really interesting developments. I thank my distinguished panel very much for this really exciting discussion, and all of you for being here. Thank you.